Hey everybody, today's video is called The Four Chariots in the Coming Branch. And today we continue our pass-through study here in our study through the book of Zechariah, where we're going to be looking at the eighth and the final vision of the four chariots. And so I know this is a little bit different. Normally I don't do a video on a Sunday. However, everything's still a little bit hectic in life with work and everything, so I wasn't able to get this video up on a Saturday, so we are posting it today on Sunday. So we are in Ezekiel chapter 6, and we'll open up in verse 1. It says, "Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, four chariots were coming from between two mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze." So representing the reality of God's judgment on the nations who attack Israel, the two mountains are probably speaking of Mount Zion and Mount Olives, where the Lord will return and judge, as the prophet Joel spoke of in Joel chapter 3. And later, we're going to see also Zechariah speaks deeper in chapter 14 as we wrap up this study. And this valley called Jehoshaphat could refer to the Kidron Valley between the two mountains. And Jehoshaphat means Jehovah judges. And one thing that even in the world of religions, one thing that you will find Jews, Muslims, and Christians have in common is that they all teach that the last judgment will be there. And the bronze has a symbolic relationship to judgment, as in the case of the bronze serpent in Numbers 21 verse 9, or the bronze altar in Exodus 27 verse 2, where sin was dealt with God. And mountains of bronze associates the mountains with strength and judgment. In verse 2 and 3, with the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, with the third chariot white horses, and with the fourth chariot dappled horses, strong steeds. So the judgment scene is further dramatized by these chariots and horses. And you can rewatch chapter 1 to see the significance of the horses' colors. And the addition of the black horses are believed to represent famine and death. And the sorrow horse has been replaced with the dappled or the spotted horses. And the chariots are hostile agents of God's judgment. And now some people see the four chariots as the four empires of the world that the prophet Daniel spoke about in Daniel's chapters 2 and chapter 7. And you can even go back and look at that. I can send it to you if you wanted to check out my study. I also know my friend Brian Peckham very early this year did a study through Daniel. And so some see them as those from the book of Revelation, as we'll discuss briefly in our wrap-up today. In verse 4 and 5 it says, "Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, 'What are these, my Lord?' And the angel answered and said to me, 'These are four spirits of heaven who go out from their station before the Lord of all the earth.'" So this imagery of the four spirits of heaven represent divine angelic agents sent out to execute judgment on behalf of the Lord of all the earth, a millennial title designating the universal rule of the Messiah in the kingdom age, as the prophet Micah also spoke about in Micah chapter 4 verse 13. Verse 6 and 7, "The one with the black horses is going to the north country. The white are going after them, and the dappled are going toward the south country. Then the strong steeds went out eager to go, that they might walk to and fro throughout the earth. And he said, 'Go walk to and fro throughout the earth.' So they walked to and fro throughout the earth." So these angelic judgment carriers unleash catastrophic judgment on the earth. And nothing is said about going east and west because of the sea and desert. And Israel's enemies came from the north, and we know they were Assyria, Babylon, the Seleucids, and the Romans, and the Egyptians came from the south. And this north and south exit leads to a worldwide unleashing of judgment on all the nations all over the earth, as spoken of by the Apostle Matthew in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 25, verse 31 through 46. Verse 8 says, "And he called to me and spoke to me, saying, See, those who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country." So, as a result of God's judgment on his enemies, his wrath can rest. And God has been avenged by this action, particularly in regard to the power from the north being judged finally. And this likely refers to the final Babylon spoken of by the Apostle John in Revelation 17:18, until this judgment is done and God's wrath rests. The kingdom cannot be established with the Messiah on his throne, as seen in John's Revelation chapter 19 and 20 of the book of Revelation. In verse 9 and 10, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Receive the gift from the captives from Chaldea, Tobijah, and Jedaiah, who have come from Babylon, and to go the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah." So the Jewish exiles who remained in Babylon, but who had come bearing gifts for the building of the temple, are identified. And we see the prophet Zechariah was told to meet them that same day and receive their gifts. And Chaldea means robust. Tobijah means God's goodness, and Jedaiah means God knows. Verse 11, "Take the silver and gold, make an elaborate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest." So the prophet Zechariah was to make a majestic crown to be set on the head of the high priest Joshua. And this is a very unusual picture seen here in the Old Testament, as it was unusual for a high priest to be crowned, as they would never be crowned like a king would be. And kings and priests, it just wasn't possible for someone to be in both offices at that time. And we see King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26 had to learn his lesson the hard way when he tried to function as a priest, and he was stricken with leprosy to the end of his life because he was a king and he tried to put on as if he was a priest. And through the history of Israel, God commanded a separation between the religious and civil leadership of Israel. And Joshua's crowning prefigured Jesus. And liberal critics will take this part of the Bible and argue that Zerubbabel should have been crowned here and that the text must be an error. But the crowning of Joshua was to give a prophecy for the king and priest, Jesus, because Jesus is king and Jesus is the high priest. In verse 12 and 13, "Then speak to him, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch." And notice in at least the New King James, branch is all capitalized, and we'll talk about the meaning of branch there very shortly. And as we continue verse 12, "From his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord." Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord. "He shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. So he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both." So the building of the restoration temple was promised to Zerubbabel. And the building of this temple promised to the Messiah points us to the construction of the millennial temple as seen in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 through 4, Ezekiel chapters 40 through 43, and Haggai chapter 2, verse 6 through 9. And for those who don't hold to the premillennial view, they see that this is pointing to Jesus ruling on the earth, and the temple is his church, and we'll discuss that in our wrap-up today a little bit deeper. And so verse 14 and 15, to finish the chapter, says, "Now the elaborate crown shall be for a memorial in the temple of the Lord, for Helem, Tobijah, Zechariah, and Hen, the son of Zephaniah. Even those from afar shall come and build the temple of the Lord. Then you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. And this shall come to pass if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God." And so the crown wasn't to be kept by Joshua, but was to serve as a memorial to the devotion of the men who came from Babylon, and more importantly, as a reminder of the coming Messiah and the ultimate hope of Israel. And Helem is another name for Haldai, and Hen another name for Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. And Hen means gracious. And so to wrap up tonight's study, in a quick wrap up, we look at the vision of the 4 chariots and their horses, seeing what Zechariah saw. And I mentioned that the Apostle John had a very similar revelation of the horses. And let's go to Revelation chapter 6, verse 1 through 8. It says here, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened up one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, 'Come and see.' Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. When he opened it, the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come and see.' So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine.' When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, 'Come and see.' So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beast of the earth." So, as I mentioned, the Apostle John had a similar image where the horsemen of the apocalypse appear in judgment imagery, riding forth in vengeance on the nations. And in the next chapter of John's Revelation, I want to read Revelation chapter 7, verse 1 through 3. Says, "After these things I saw the 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, and the sea, or any tree. Then I saw another angel descending from the east, having the sail of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.'" So some see the chariots in Zechariah's vision as angelic messengers of judgment, like the Apostle John saw the 4 angels. And so Zechariah chapter 6, verse 4 through 8 showed us what the vision meant. And verse 9 showed us the command to make a crown for Joshua. And that was verse 9 through 11 was the command to make a crown for Joshua. Verse 12 through 13 shows the prophecy of the branch who is both king and priest. And branch, the big capital in verse 12, B-R-A-N-C-H, points us to Christ, who would build the temple of the Lord, his church. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. Ephesians 2, verse 19 through 22. Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are also being built together for the dwelling place of God in the Spirit. So the chapter ends with the crown as a memorial. And that's going to wrap up our study for today. And I'll let you know when our next study will be, as we'll be looking at how obedience is better than ritual being spoken of by the prophet Zechariah. So I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, great Sunday. God bless, and we'll see you next time.